Here are the 8 books I read in February. I'm Veronica, and this is the Reading Chronicles. First, I read The Other Significant Others, Reimagining Life with Friendship at the Center by Raina Cohen, published in 2024. Over Christmas, my besties sent me a link to an episode of the podcast, Up First from NPR, saying, "This reminds me of us." I listened to the episode about people who had chosen to forge their lives with friendship at the center, for whom friendship was just as important, sometimes even more important, than their romantic relationships, and how that flew in the eyes of our society that always puts romantic relationships above everything else. I should mention my bestie is a dude. So the nature of our relationship has been the cause of much speculation over the more than 20 years that we've known each other, most notably during the time when we lived together. The podcast host, Aisha Roscoe, had moved into her house with her best friend, and they were co-parenting their children, and she interviewed Cohen. Now, I'm pretty sure I had heard about this book before, though I can't really remember where, but this podcast episode prompted me to get it from the library to know more about people for whom friendship played a large role in their lives. Now, the premise of the book is essentially working to undo the notion that a romantic relationship is inherently at the center of one's life. To be clear, Cohen isn't only talking about people who have never been married or about gay people who for many years were not legally allowed to marry, but also people who have been married and who have what might be called a significant friendship, or people who have been married but have lost their spouse either through divorce or death and have carried on with a platonic life partner. The truth is, our society and legal system have no way of recognizing the importance of these types of friendships. While you can get married pretty quickly, there's a much more involved process of naming someone you're not related to, whether through blood or marriage, as power of attorney or medical advocate. And even then, even if you achieve that, there might still be pushback as to what rights that person is allowed. And wouldn't you know it, we have patriarchy to blame for that. And Cohen dives into the history of same-sex intimacy, saying that the belief in the West that same-sex intimacy necessarily involves sexual desire gained traction a couple of decades ago. A pamphlet titled Satan's Harvest Home, published in 1749 in London, claimed that men who greeted each other with a kiss, at that point still a ubiquitous greeting, were set on the path to Sodom. Disgust toward sodomy in 18th century England swelled, and authorities rounded up accused sodomites in mass arrests and executions. With the specter of sex now hanging over men's physical interactions, it made sense for them to withdraw from one another. She goes on to say that at the turn of the 20th century in the US, a harder, more aggressive form of masculinity became the norm, and this was embodied in Teddy Roosevelt. And this acted as a sort of compensation for men's loss in economics and political power as women gained power in those realms. The category of homosexuality and the accompanying stigma emerged. She says, if men express love for a male friend, his attention could be misread as sexual. Indeed, as Cohen interviews numerous friend couples throughout this book, it's the male ones who deal the most with the assumption that two men cannot be close without them being sexually attracted to each other. And I'd say the same is true for male-female relationships, as it never ceases to amaze me how much people will twist themselves into knots trying to understand my friendship with my bestie. And when I moved in with him, my parents' neighbor even said that She thought that I just didn't want people to know that we were in a relationship with each other. She thought that we lived together, which everyone knew about, but that we were lying about being romantically involved. What sense would that make? It seems that people will do anything possible, come up with any explanation they can, save for the very simple explanation that we're friends. Now, did I learn anything particularly new in this book? Not really. You can't maintain a decades-long friendship with a member of the opposite sex, with both of those people being heterosexual, without having been forced to think about the ways society just does not value platonic love. But the stories of friendship that Cohen relates in the book are heartening, and it's worthwhile to know that there are other people who put friendship at the center of their lives, and that they are undeniably richer for it. Next, I listened to The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix, narrated by Bonnie Turpin, and published in 2020. Now, I'll say this book was not what I expected. What I expected was a sort of horror comedy story. I know we're not supposed to judge books by their covers, but what else was I supposed to think with that cover and with this kind of title? And I had read one of Hendrix's other books before, Horror Store, about people being trapped in an IKEA and like ghostly things, paranormal things happening. And I don't remember it being particularly gruesome. And that was not the case here. I will say up front that if sexual assault is a trigger for you, do not read this book. I know that eroticism has long been a part of the vampire mythos, but what happens in this book is outright assault. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to go into the particulars of that scene in this review. Just know that it's there, so if that's an issue, don't read this book. Now, this book is set in the 90s in South Carolina and centers on Patricia Campbell, a bored housewife who gets little from the uppity classics reading book club she belongs to. Now, when one of the members suggests that they start their own book club, they begin reading true crime and get the chance to think about something outside of their sleepy husband and children-centered lives. Patricia in particular is yearning for more excitement, and she gets it when James Harris moves into his deceased aunt's house in the neighborhood. It turns out that James is mighty good at investments, and all of the men take a liking to him. There's just one problem. James is a vampire. Now, Hendrix tries to do a couple of things here. In part, the novel is an ode or an homage to neglected housewives. He shows how their husbands dismiss them, refusing to believe them when they try to raise alarm about James. Of course, they don't quite know he's a vampire at this point, but they know he's hurting people. And the husbands even take over their wives' book club, forcing them to read Tom Clancy and other dude books of that ilk. I think Hendrix is pretty successful at painting the men as the sort of, like, don't worry your pretty little head about it, misogynists, and even showing how this can lead to greater, more serious forms of control and abuse. In another way, the novel is also about race and white obliviousness to Black suffering. Patricia hires Mrs. Green, a Black woman, to care for her aging mother-in-law. When Mrs. Green reveals to Patricia and another member of the book club that James's vehicle has been seen in their neighborhood and children have gone missing or have died in mysterious ways, the other woman responds by saying that she hadn't read anything about that in the newspaper, implying that it couldn't be true. Mrs. Green rightfully chides them for not caring about what happens in the Black neighborhood until it affected their own children. I was initially unsure about the way Hendrix handled race, with Mrs. Green portrayed as a sort of mammy stereotype, but the way she takes the white women to task for their ignorance mostly redeems that. I do think Hendrix could have done better than the position of one of the only black characters in the story being essentially a servant and the one who has to save the white lady's butts, but he does give her agency and a voice, so there's that. On the other hand, do you ever get irrationally angry at a story for getting basic facts wrong? There's a point when Patricia goes to see James at his house shortly after he's moved in, and James says he can't be in the sun, obviously because he's a vampire, but he says he can't be in the sun because his irises don't dilate right. First of all, irises don't dilate. Pupils do. Second of all, if your eyes didn't dilate correctly, you wouldn't have a problem being in the sun. You would have a problem being in the dark. That would mean that your pupils stayed small, which is what you want in the sun. Anyone who has ever gone to the optometrist and had their eyes dilated can tell you how much of a problem it is going back into the sun. I was in the middle of working out when I heard this, and I had to rewind when I finished my set because I thought I must have heard that wrong, because that is just basic knowledge. And then when I confirmed what I heard, I had to Google it just to make sure I hadn't misunderstood eyes my entire, or almost of my entire glasses wearing life, or contacts wearing life. But no. Tell me that you don't have to go to yearly eye exams without telling me you don't have to go to yearly eye exams. Great for you for having that 20/20 vision. Also, this information is just a Google away. I'm not sure if Hendrix or the editor is to blame here, but someone was obviously sleeping that day. There is also a concern about one of the characters having an autoimmune disease, and another character worries that there will be assumptions that this person has AIDS. Now, autoimmune and acquired immune are two different things. And while, yes, this is taking place in the 90s, and maybe Hendrix is trying to show that the characters are not all that intelligent, Patricia used to be a nurse, and I would expect her to know these kinds of things, both the things about the eyes and the difference between an autoimmune disease and AIDS. Also, one of the characters says that gazpacho is from Italy. So, I didn't hate this story, despite these little nitpicks that I have. But I also didn't really love it. I guess it was fine. But I also don't know that I will be encouraged to pick up another one of Hendrix's stories in the future. Next was The Unconsoled by Kazuo Ishiguro, published in 1995. Now, I'll go into a little bit more detail in this in a separate video, doing my year of Kazuo Ishiguro, but to sum up my immediate reactions, this was a wild ride. I can do little more than say that this was like the literary embodiment of an anxiety dream in which you keep trying to reach some goal, but the entire world seems bent on stopping you. Briefly, I'll say that this story focuses on a world-renowned pianist who we know as Mr. Ryder, who has arrived in an unnamed European city to give the performance of his life, only he doesn't remember agreeing to give this performance or to the other things he's told are on his schedule. With interferences from people from his past, people in town, journalists, and even a literal wall, Ryder tries in vain to get to the performance hall so he can give this promised recital, although he's still not sure what he'll play at the outset of the novel. This is different from any other Ishiguro book I've read. Find out more in a later video whether or not I liked that. My next listen was The Midnight Library by Matt Haig, narrated by Carey Mulligan and published in 2020. So I decided to listen to this book because it's gotten a lot of hype and I heard that a movie is being planned. So I was curious about it, even though I kind of thought I wouldn't like it. To me, it seems sort of like a Hallmark movie that passes off depression and suicidality as phases that can easily be cured, and that's not really my thing. But I've been wrong about popular books before, so I thought, why not give it a shot? And I wish I had been wrong about this one. So this story focuses on Nora Seed, who is unhappy in her life and the directions her choices have led her. She's been fired from her job, her best friend is in Australia, she and her brother are estranged, she's broken up with the boyfriend she thought she was going to marry, and her cat has just died. So Nora decides to take a bunch of pills, but instead of dying, she ends up in this sort of in-between world in a library filled with a bunch of books and run by her former school librarian, Mrs. Elm. Elm and Seed. Not a fan of the subtle symbolism, are we, Matt? So Mrs. Elm explains to her that these books all contain potential directions of her life based on the different decisions she's made, and her goal is to find the life that makes her happiest. Now, I typically love anything that has this sort of Twilight Zone vibe to it, but this was like the Twilight Zone mixed with sliding doors, with far less of the creepy feel a Twilight Zone episode would give you, and more like a montage of Nora trying on a bunch of lives like outfits during a makeover. Of course, for every decision she chooses, there are a myriad of other effects. Reuniting with her boyfriend doesn't mean they have a strong relationship. Becoming a glaciologist, one of her childhood dreams, doesn't mean that she loves it. Becoming an Olympic swimmer doesn't mean that she feels fulfilled. And while the novel comes dangerously close to suggesting that wife and motherhood are the only ways Nora can be happy, it thankfully veers from that at the last second. Although the fact that Nora spent the most time in this life and didn't understand why it didn't suit her well didn't sit really right with me. I don't doubt that being an Olympian or in a world famous band have their drawbacks, but they were dismissed so quickly in comparison to Nora's time in conventional bliss. I also found the writing a bit repetitive. Each time Nora enters a new book, she has to spend time being confused, trying to figure out who everyone is in this timeline and what her relationship to them is. Even if she knows the person, such as her brother, she still has to figure out why their relationship is different than the timeline that she had in her root life. That is the life that she attempted to leave behind. And the end, it is the most simplistic ending you could have ever expected, and you can see it from a mile away. Have you seen It's a Wonderful Life? Because if you have, there is nothing new for you here. Now, I'm fortunate to have not had to deal with mental illness in my life, but I can imagine those who have may take umbrage with the very light and sweet way that suicide is treated here. Ultimately, this story really did nothing for me. Next, I read The True Story of Raja the Gullible and His Mother by Rabih Alameddine, published in 2025. So coming soon, I'll have a wrap-up of all of the prize-winning books of 2025 that I read. So this will also be just a brief summary of this National Book Award winner for fiction. So first I have to bring attention to Alameddine's author photo. Is this not the most amazing author photo you've ever seen? Now, I'm not up on the lingo of the youths today, but I'm pretty sure this is what they mean when they say it's giving. What's it giving? I don't quite know, but it is definitely giving. So anyway, this story follows a 60-something Raja, quiet, introverted, who after a series of less than fortunate events finds himself having to bring his boisterous, extroverted mother to come live with him. Following Lebanese history pre, during, and post-Civil War, and up through the pandemic, the novel is told through Raja's unique narrative style, and he explains to readers why he has given himself the moniker of the Gullible. You'll hear more about my thoughts on this novel in an upcoming video. The next two books are ones I highlighted in my January 5 books I'm excited for video. The first one is The Great Shadow, a history of how sickness shapes what we do, think, believe, and buy, by Susan Wise Bauer, published this year in 2026. So in this book of medical history, Wise Bauer traces the way knowledge and beliefs about illness impact culture and society, from Hippocrates' belief that health is maintained by balancing the humors, to erroneous beliefs about outsiders carrying certain germs, paving the way for the Holocaust, to the development of vaccines. What becomes evident is that for all our technology and medical knowledge and how it develops, history can't help but repeat itself. I will say that for a topic this large, this is a slim volume. It's little more than 300 pages. And Wise Bauer briefly touches on many medical aspects that could fill an entire book by themselves. We learned that diseases began to infect ancient humans when settlements developed and groups were no longer on the move. And the animals they kept with them also allowed for the transfer of bacteria and viruses. Growing cities also saw growing rates of death among citizens. And the belief became that illness was an invader from the outside, and those who fell ill had only their own shortcomings to blame. Sadly, this belief is still with us, for while we do know more about germs and the way that they're spread, we still largely blame individuals for their own failures in health. Just look at the proliferation of healthy lifestyle websites or social media accounts promising that if you drink this green juice or practice this type of yoga or use a red light mask, you'll optimize your health. Companies have made billions off the belief that we're the only ones who can keep ourselves healthy. Now, Wise Bauer puts in a good effort to draw a line from our beliefs about illness to major moments in history that continue to affect us today. The Black Plague ramped up anti-Semitism, with some claiming that Jewish people purchased poison and dumped it in the wells and fountains in Germany. When typhus, which is carried by lice, infected German troops in Poland in World War I, it was claimed that this disease had an affinity for Jewish bodies and led to them being isolated in ghettos when Germany invaded Poland several years later. When North America began to be colonized, it was believed that the heat of the southern colonies was not compatible with English bodies, so that was where convicted criminals, the poor, and the misfits were sent. And while resistance to vaccines was once attributed to the belief that vaccines went against God's will, they now reside in a distrust of big pharma on the right and confidence in the body's ability to heal itself on the left. What is perhaps most surprising is doctors' own resistance to new developments in knowledge about the spread of germs, such as when more women who gave birth in hospitals began dying compared to women who had given birth at home. The doctors believed themselves to be so high and mighty that they couldn't possibly be spreading germs from one patient to another, and the idea of simply washing hands in between patients was seen as absolutely preposterous. And as will become important in the next book I talk about, When 1 in 10 soldiers in World War I ended up with syphilis or gonorrhea, French prostitutes and loose women were blamed, even though in the US, at least, 5 out of 6 of those cases had been contracted before the soldiers went overseas. The result of all of this is that we still expect individuals to keep themselves healthy and blame illness on some sort of personal or moral failing. We buy antibacterial soaps and sprays and single-use everything to keep others' germs off us. Although the idea of having a central water source with a cup hanging off of it that everyone in the town drank from, as Bauer talks about in olden days, that's certainly not appealing to me. That idea made me want to gag. But when a new virus arrived in our times, we blamed immigrants and those not like us, just like people in the past did. It seems that we may be doomed to repeat this cycle for eternity. In all, this book is a sufficient primer for medical history and how illness affects our behaviors today. Where it lacks is in its brevity, often not going deep enough into some areas that are certainly more complex than they are presented here, and sometimes in the presentation of figures that don't quite make sense, as well as an oddly placed Harry Potter reference that I was really surprised hadn't been edited out in this day and age. Now, I don't think a person who has any sort of medical history will find anything new or even really interesting here, but for a layperson like me, it was perfectly fine. Keeping in mind this idea that American soldiers were found to have been infected with venereal diseases and a campaign was enacted to free them of disease, we have Women of a Promiscuous Nature by Donna Everhart, also published in 2026. Now, this book focuses on that idea, specifically the Chamberlain-Conn Act of 1918, saying that, and there is a quote from it in the beginning of this book, saying that the Secretary of War and the Secretary of the Navy are hereby authorized and directed to adopt measures for the purpose of assisting the various states in caring for civilian persons whose detention, isolation, quarantine, or commitment to institutions may be found necessary for the protection of the military and naval forces of the United States against venereal diseases. So this is a book of historical fiction, and in it we follow 3 women. First, Mrs. Dorothy Baker, the superintendent of the State Industrial Farm Colony for Women in North Carolina, and 2 of its residents, 15-year-old Stella Temple and 24-year-old Ruth Foster. Now, the 2 women's crimes. Stella has found herself in a way after nighttime visits from her father. Now, Ruth has been living alone and working at a diner. Stella's mother takes her to a doctor when she finds out Stella's situation, although she doesn't know who caused that situation, and the doctor recommends the colony for a sort of rehabilitation. Ruth, on the other hand, is minding her own business when she's picked up by a cop who takes her for testing and she's found to be infected, although she's never done more than kiss a man. The purpose of the colony? To restore these individuals to proper womanhood, although that's really just a euphemism for subjugation, corporal punishment, and non-consensual medical treatments. Told through these 3 women's eyes in alternating chapters, we see the colony through 3 different lenses. In Ruth, we see how it does nothing more than strip women of their rights and weaken them so they're unlikely to fight back. Many of the residents' backstories are similar to Ruth's, doing little more than living on their own, unmarried, and childless to raise suspicion. In Stella, we see how the colony is something of a salvation. For all the harm it does, she would rather be there than be at home with her father, and other women have chosen the colony over being sent to jail for their supposed wrongdoings. In Mrs. Baker, we see how sometimes the most insidious participants and upholders of the patriarchy are women, and how they take what little power they can glean and lord it over those who have less. What happens to the women at the colony is appalling, even more so when you remember that although this book is fiction, the story is based in fact. Now, it's unfortunate that any story that deals with the oppression of women has to be compared to The Handmaid's Tale, but I'm still going to do it. Now, while Women of a Promiscuous Nature does just fine to expose one of the many dark spots in our nation's history, the story itself is less spellbinding than Atwood's. To me, what makes part of The Handmaid's Tale so horrifying is that you don't fully know what's going on. You have to discover it or uncover it throughout the writing. Here, everything is pretty much laid out bare, with Stella acting as the kind of simple-minded audience surrogate, saying things as naive as, "They wouldn't do that. Would they put people in here who ain't done nothing?" Honey, of course they would. We can perhaps forgive Stella for her naivete, but having her be one of the viewpoints from which the story is told makes it seem as though Everhart doesn't quite trust her reader to understand the irony or severity of the situation. And much of the story is told in that obvious sort of way. Now, while the facts of the story still make it a compelling piece of history, the writing kind of makes it less of a compelling novel. In all, the story is fine, and it did pique my interest in wanting to know more about the Chamberlain-Conn Act, particularly with the mention of the nonfiction work The Trials of Nina McCall, Sex Surveillance, and the decades-long plan to imprison promiscuous women by Scott W. Stern. I'll probably be reading that book in the future. Last, I listened to Margo's Got Money Troubles by Rufi Thorpe, narrated by Elle Fanning and published in 2024. This was another book that I heard was being made into, I think, a TV series this time. And because I was somewhat interested in the book, I decided to listen to the audio. Now, the novel centers on Margo, who gets pregnant at 19 after having an affair with her college professor, and who, despite her professor's assumptions, decides to keep the baby. After baby Bodhi is born, Margo finds that she has little support to fall back on. Her mother is no help, especially since she's started dating a religious guy to whom she initially lies about Margo having a child. Her boss fires her after she misses work, and her roommates move out because they're unable to study in an apartment with a crying child. Now, Margo reaches out for help to her ex-pro wrestler father, and he does end up moving in with them, but more because he's going through his own divorce. Nevertheless, Jinx does prove to be one of the most supportive people in Margo's life, even after she makes a surprising decision regarding her finances. She decides to start an OnlyFans account. The novel is a pretty straightforward tale of what would happen if a young single mother had to turn to sex work to survive, with the twist of focusing on modern-day social media. I can't say that I found any of it particularly surprising. Margo works to build her account and following. The revelation that she's doing sex work calls her parenting skills into question, and Bodhi's father, who previously wanted nothing to do with the child, threatens to have him taken away. Jinx does what he can to help Margo, but he's got problems of his own, ones that put Margo's custody of the baby in jeopardy. And there's also the requisite potential romance. The conflicts are pretty typical of a story of this nature, although no doubt they're reflective of what women in this situation actually go through. The story does have some poignant moments, such as when Margo reflects that she thought she was doing the right thing by keeping the baby, But it seems that no matter what, having the baby or having an abortion would have made her a bad person in some people's eyes. A lot of the fuss over Margo doing OnlyFans also made me think about one of the early episodes of True Detective in which a woman tells Woody Harrelson's philandering character that, or something to the effect that men are more than willing to take it, but God forbid women make a buck off of it. The double standard is real. The book never goes too deep into these issues, and I don't think it means to, nor does it have to, but I would have found it more satisfying if it had taken time to explore these ideas beyond what if a young single mother strapped for cash started an OnlyFans account. You won't have your mind blown by this book, but it's a perfectly fine listen or read. Well, those were my books for February. What books made your month? Let me know in the comments. See you in the next video.